All right, hi everyone. I hope you're having a great day. So this is lecture video 4, where we're going to wrap up module 1. So in this lecture video, we're going to be talking about social development, some different things in the environment that play a role in the developmental process. A couple of things to remember here. So activity 3 is going to be discussed in the lecture video. If you have questions about the assignments, please let me know. Remember that your responses need to be at least 200 words long and your own original work. And if you use any sources, you need to cite those appropriately. Also, once you've finished lecture video 4, you'll have all the information that you need to be successful on exam 1. I will be posting a review video and a practice exam for extra credit to help you prepare. But as always, if you have any questions, please let me know. So let's go ahead and jump into lecture. Alright, so as I said during today's lecture video, we're going to be focusing on socio-emotional development. So specifically, we're going to be talking about some theories about how our development is impacted by the people that we spend time around, as well as the culture that we live in. So we're going to start off by talking about Bronfenbrenners Theory, and you'll see that Bronfenbrenners Theory has several different layers to our social context, maybe some things that we haven't thought about before, or the things that don't immediately come to mind when I talk about social influences. But in addition, we're also going to be talking about Ericksons Lifespan theory. And so Erickson's name may sound familiar, but if it doesn't yet, it will shortly. So starting off with Bronfenbrenners ecological theory. So Bronfenbrenners theory here is going to focus on the social context in which people live. And he's going to go into great detail and great depth when it comes to your social context. So if I were to ask you, first of all, who has impacted the person you are today? You might say, well, my parents, my siblings, my friends, maybe some teachers, that kind of thing. But there are several different layers to our social world that we might not automatically think of, but that does not mean that these layers don't impact us. They can impact us on a daily basis without us really realizing it or thinking about it. So what you're going to see as we go through and talk about Bronfenbrenners theory is that there are going to be layers. So here you are in the middle. This is the individual. This is the person who is being influenced. And then we have layers of influence. It's like onions. Here we're peeling back the layers, and we're seeing that as we have layers that get further and further away, these are influences that still impact us, maybe impact us on a daily basis, but they are further away from the individual. They're maybe not something that you spend a lot of time with or as much time with, and yet they can still impact you. So first of all, as I said, you start off with the individual in the center. So this is the person who is being influenced. And then the closest layer to that person is what we call, or Bronfenbrenner would call, the microsystem. Now, your personal microsystem, these are the individuals that you have the most direct contact with. So these are probably people that you see on a very regular, if not daily basis. So you have direct interactions with the components of your microsystem. So for example, a person's microsystem might consist of family members. Now, you may have some family members that you would consider part of your microsystem, and some that maybe are not part of your microsystem. It depends on the individual. So for example, some people are very close to their cousins and spend a lot of time with their cousins. And if that's the case for you, then your cousins might be part of your microsystem. But some of us may not see our cousins, may not talk to our cousins, may just vaguely keep up with our cousins on Facebook. And in that situation, you would not consider your cousins to be part of your microsystem. So every person's little graph here is going to look different because the people that you are impacted by vary a little bit. But in your microsystem, you would likely have family members, close family members like parents, potentially siblings. If we're talking about a child here, then the people that live in their home for sure. Also, your school is probably a microsystem. So if we're thinking about a child, you have teacher, you have peers that you interact with on a very regular basis at school. And then there may be some other parts of your microsystem that are unique to you. So for example, you could potentially have a religious group here, a church or other, that might be part of your microsystem, people that you interact with very frequently. Maybe a neighborhood play area or friends that you spend a lot of time with. Now, this is your microsystem, and your microsystem would be the individuals who most directly impact you. But if we move out a little bit here, your mesosystem refers to the linkages between microsystems. So, for example, your mother is part of your microsystem, your teacher is part of your microsystem, but the relationship between your mother and your teacher would be considered a mesosystem. It's a connection between two members of your microsystem. So that's a little bit more withdrawn from you, a little bit further away from you, because it doesn't necessarily involve you directly, but there's a relationship perhaps between your parents and the school, or between your parents and your peers. So maybe we could have a discussion, and if we were having an in-person class, we might have this discussion about at what point do parents start trying to influence the peers that you spend time with, and at what point, if ever, do your parents stop trying to influence the peers that you spend time with. But your mesosystem is just the relationship between the components of your microsystem. And then when you go out another layer here, you have the exosystem. Now, the exosystem would be parts of your social world that impact you, and yet you probably don't have as much of an active role with them. So, like, for example, it lists things like neighbors and friends of family. But this depends on your situation. These are just examples. So for some people, your neighbors might be your microsystem if you spend a ton of time with them on a regular basis. But for other people, just having the people living around you kind of generally influencing you would make it more of an exosystem. But in addition, for example, the media. So the media is a part of your social influence, even if you don't think about it. The things that are on TV, the things that are covered, and what people are saying on the news, that kind of thing. The child doesn't have any control over those influences, but they do still influence the child. And then things like welfare services, legal services, laws that are passed. So legislation, although it's not something the child has any control over, legislation would still impact the child. So we can even go further out from that and talk about your macro system, which would be the larger overarching culture that you live in. So, for example, we live in American culture, which is typically considered very individualistic. So when you're comparing and contrasting individualistic versus a collectivist culture, an individualistic culture is one in which we tend to be thinking about ourselves more. We tend to be looking out for ourselves. So independence is valued and personal achievement is valued. On the other hand, some cultures, and they often use examples of Eastern cultures, but several different cultures could have a collectivist viewpoint. The collectivist viewpoint is that it's more about the culture at large and the family in particular being successful rather than having the individual be successful. So it's more of a focus on unity, on fitting in, less on the standing out, being the MVP. That would be individualistic, but more like fitting in and helping the group at large, which would be a collectivist culture. So you are born into a culture, and every aspect of that culture influences you, even if you don't realize it. If you've never been to a different culture, you might not even realize that some of the things that we do here in America are not done everywhere else. And even a little bit closer to home, if you have been raised in the South, if you live in the South, you know that the South is different from other parts of the country. Even though we are part of American culture, we still have some unique cultural things that happen in the South as well. So your culture impacts you. And then the chronosystem refers to the socio-historical conditions. So this really has to do with a time period. So right now, during this current time period, things are different than if you were raised in the same location 100 years ago. And I'm sure in 100 years from now, things will still be very different. So chronosystem refers to the historical conditions that an individual is raised in. Probably not something you would have listed as, I am impacted by growing up during this time period, but it definitely does impact you. So I like Bronfenbrenners Theory. I like that it considers many different layers of your social network. So let's have some practice here. There's just an example that has a lot of different layers of influence here. So Sid's father left his family provides no support for them, so Sid and his siblings live with their mother in a public housing project. They received public assistance in the form of reduced rent, money to live on, food program. Sid and his siblings receive free school lunches, don't have to pay the standard book fee, free medical care when ill, but Sid's mother considers their care to be substandard, so she's contacted legal aid about obtaining child support. So, first of all, this does not give a full picture of Sid's social life, but it does give some information here. So it says, what aspects of Sid's microsystem are discussed? So your microsystem, those are the people that are most directly impacted, like impacting you, and people that you interact with. So I would say his mother and his siblings. I would say the school system. We talked about the schools. Potentially with the medical care, if they see the doctor frequently, a doctor could potentially be considered part of the microsystem. What I would say is that it does not seem like Sid's father is part of his microsystem, even though that is like a close biological relationship. If this is not someone that he sees frequently, spends a lot of time around, then he may not count as part of Sid's microsystem. It talks about what aspects of Sid's exosystem. That's that layer where, although you're still very directly impacted by it, it's not something that Sid has any control over. So some examples that we see sprinkled throughout here, things like the medical care as far as maybe the legislation on medical care, maybe things like the legislation related to the food program or what's going on in the school system, that kind of thing. So also it talks about the legal aid, so a lawyer that is helping Sid's mom might be considered part of Sid's exosystem as well. Okay, and then it says, how is the mesosystem currently operating? Well, remember that the mesosystem refers to the linkages between microsystems. So, for example, you would want to look at how Sid's mother, who would be a part of his microsystem, how she interacts with his teacher. It doesn't give us a lot of information about that. It does seem like there may be some issues between, like, maybe Sid's mother and the doctor, potentially. So there could be some issues going on there. But what I want to point out is that each individual will have their own unique microsystem, mesosystem, exosystem, because it's really just about how these things are impacting you. And if they're not impacting you, they wouldn't be part of your little graph here, but they might be a part of someone else's. Alright, so good things about Bronfenbrenner. Bronfenbrenners Theory encourages us to think about children embedded in several environmental systems and influences. So I think sometimes we miss the influences in our own lives, but we also miss the influences in other people's lives as well. So when we're trying to think about motivating a child, about meeting a child's needs, you do need to think about things like the larger culture. You do need to think about things like neighborhoods, that kind of thing. Not necessarily just the individuals that are closest to the student, but thinking about the several different layers. I also like the concept of a mesosystem, the idea that the people that you care about that are closest to you also need to have healthy relationships, because that impacts you. So it would encourage us, especially as educators, to think about the relationship between schools and families. So certainly it is important for a child to have a good relationship with their teacher and a good relationship with a parent, but we want to encourage good communication between parent and teacher, and we're going to have a little bit later in the lecture some information about that. But also, in addition to the microsystem and the mesosystem, Bronfenbrenners Theory also thinks about things like the community that you live in, your culture at large, socioeconomic status, historical time period also is important. Alright, so we're talking about theories that are related to your socio-emotional development today. So shifting gears to Ericksons Lifespan Theory. Now, there will be some aspects of Ericksons Lifespan Theory that will remind you of Piaget that we talked about during the cognitive development lecture. So like Piaget, Ericksons Theory is going to have stages. These stages are going to be progressing in a fixed order, and so it does look a bit discontinuous. You will see that there are specific age ranges for some of these stages, but not for all of these stages. Some of them are a little bit more open-ended with the particular ages. Now, what you're going to see with Ericksons theory is that each stage is going to be characterized by a crisis or a challenge. Basically, Erickson believed that there are particular socio-emotional things going on during particular time periods of life. And as you face these challenges, if you succeed during that stage, then you'll move on into the next stage with some strength and some resiliency that you gained from your success in the previous stage. If you fail, then you will carry that with you as well and will make the following stages more difficult. So, according to Erickson, these stages are going to reflect the unique motivation that we feel during different time periods. So we're going to go through and talk about each one of these, and then afterwards we'll talk about some good things and some bad things about Erickson's development. So, first of all, I like this picture here. This is just an overview of the 8 stages that Erickson suggested. But I like because it shows you what I mean when I say discontinuous. This idea that you are in stage 1 and stage 1 is pretty much looking the same, and then all of a sudden when you hit stage 2 it's time to jump up, and you have this discontinuous theory of development. And then you would stay roughly the same until you're ready for stage 3, and then you would jump up. This is contrasted with a continuous view of development where it would kind of gradually slope, and so you couldn't see exactly what stage a person is in at any given moment. Alright, so Erickson's stages are going to start off with the first stage, trust and mistrust. So according to Erickson, this is basically the major challenge of the first year socially for a child. So during that first year, of course, that's a time period where a child is very dependent upon caregivers. So Erickson would say that during this time period, a child will either learn to trust their caregivers or not to trust their caregivers. Now, this is something that there's been research on about, like, for example, children crying. So a child cries because they have a need. They need something, and because they're not able to express that need in any other way. Now, as you can imagine, that can be frustrating for a parent or caregiver to try to understand why a child is crying. But a parent that provides consistent love and support and meets needs consistently will then be demonstrating to the child, I care about you, you can trust me to meet your needs. On the other hand, when a parent or caregiver does not consistently meet the needs of the child may struggle with this mistrust. Now, this is not something that the child is consciously thinking about. Language and thought have not developed to that level, but it's an instinctual thing that children will learn, my needs are not going to be met. And it's sad, but you see this sometimes with children who are in orphanages, especially if there are so many children and not enough caregivers. What you'll see is that the children will actually stop crying. If there are many more children there than you have caregivers, then the babies will not be able to have their needs met consistently. Basically, what we're saying is that crying isn't doing you any good because you're not getting what you need from that. And so the children will actually stop crying. And so this can be something that is sometimes a challenge for adoptive parents. Children that have been in like an orphanage setting may not express their needs because they're not used to having those needs met. So Erickson would say if parents provide consistent love and support, then a child learns how to trust and they're able to move confidently into the next stage. Now the next stage, which is roughly years 1 through 3, is autonomy versus shame and doubt. So this is a time period where children start to want some independence, and some will want more independence than others. But if a child is not given at least appropriate levels of independence here, the child may start to doubt their ability to take care of themselves or their ability to do basic things, and may become clingy, overly dependent upon parents. So what you would want to do to try to help a child navigate this time period is to provide independence in appropriate amounts and appropriate situations, and encourage the child for engaging in independent behavior. So for example, this is maybe a time where you let kids start picking out what they want to wear. Now that does not, man, you will be here all day long. If you tell my daughter go pick out something to wear, she will have 14 outfits all over the floor before she makes up her mind. But perhaps you could, and she's not even in this stage, but no, perhaps you could hold up some clothes, like maybe, like, do you want to wear this shirt or this shirt? You know, do you want to have mac and cheese or grilled cheese for lunch? You know, giving kids some choices here, and you know, within reason, giving children a chance to have some independence. So then moving on to stage 3, initiative versus guilt. This is roughly years 3 through 5. During this time period, children want to start to explore. Children want to start taking on challenges. Now, this is something that can be very nerve-wracking for some parents, because some parents are not ready for their 3 to 5-year-old to take on certain challenges. I can remember being terrified. There's I don't know, I guess it's a ladder. I guess you would call it like a ladder at a park that I take my kids to. There's this ladder, and it curves, you know, and the rungs are just, I just feel like, oh my God, the child's going to fall off. We're going to have, you know, slip. This is just terrifying for me. And so it was really hard for myself and for my husband when my kids, you know, during this time period wanted to start climbing up this sloping ladder thing that was just terrifying. And so I would try to stand close enough where obviously if there was a problem I could swoop in and save the day. But I would try very hard to be calm and confident and not scare my kids, because I wanted to encourage them to take on new challenges, even when it terrified me. All right, good. The next stage would be from about age 6 through puberty. So this is where we're going to see general age ranges rather than specific ages. Stage 4 is industry versus inferiority. This is happening when children start going to school. So during that time period, children are faced with some new tasks, learning how to read, learning how to write, learning mathematics skills. But in addition to that, they're also potentially comparing themselves to their same age peers for the first time. So if you are a child who is successful academically, or maybe successful athletically, or in whatever area you care about that you're learning, then that would give you confidence. That would make you feel good about yourself. But also during this time period, some children may become aware of the fact that they're not as good students as their classmates. Maybe they're not the best athlete, perhaps. So this is a time period where children try to develop some skills and some ability so that they can have some success and some recognition, which continues to be important, but Erickson would say is especially important during this stage. If a person does not receive that recognition, then those feelings of inferiority can start to kick in. All right. During adolescence, those maybe teenage years we're thinking here, this is, according to Erickson, a time where we struggle with identity versus role confusion. So we remember, I'm sure you guys remember, what it was like to be a teenager. I don't know if any of you guys would want to go back to adolescence. I can guarantee you I would go to great lengths not to have to go back through adolescence. But during this time period, you are struggling with trying to figure out who you are. And so there are healthy ways to do this, and then there are less healthy ways to do this. So it's healthy for a child to maybe try on some different roles, maybe thinking about, where do I find my identity? Is it through music? Is it through school? Is it through sports? Or is it through my peer group, looking for their identity? However, there are times here where peer pressure can make this process a lot harder. There are times where bullying can come in here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that coming up. Or potentially where a child starts following some unhealthy behaviors that their peers may be engaging in, things like drugs and alcohol at an early age, that kind of thing. So Erickson would say that you struggle with identity most during adolescence. And then once you hit the early adult years, probably the vast majority of you guys fall into this category. This is a time for intimacy versus isolation, where we are focusing on developing close positive relationships. This does not necessarily have to refer to romantic relationships, although that would be included. But during this time period is probably when you're moving away, going to college, getting a job, kind of starting your own social world. And so in addition to romantic relationships, it would also be important to have good peer relationships, friend relationships, co-workers, that kind of thing. All right. As you move from early adulthood to middle adulthood, and I don't have specific age ranges here, once again, this is a general concept, and I think as you get older, you start to think middle adulthood starts much later, right? That can't be me. We always try to convince ourselves we're not aging. But anyway, that's a whole nother conversation for another class. But somewhere in here, middle adulthood happens. Generativity versus stagnation is the idea that once you're like, okay, it's not exactly a midlife crisis. More like, okay, I'm getting to a point where I may have more years behind me than I have ahead of me, thinking about transmitting something positive to the next generation. So there are several different ways to think about doing this. Some individuals may focus on doing this financially. So I want to make sure my family is financially stable. Some individuals may do this by wanting to pass on life skills or memories or things to our children, and then potentially to grandchildren as well. Some people may do this with other individuals. So what happens if you don't have children or you don't have grandchildren? Can you still satisfy this need? Yes. There are other ways to pass things on to the next generation. Being a mentor, volunteering, helping other people in your neighborhood, in your church, or wherever, can still be part of transmitting something positive to the next generation. And then the last stage during late adulthood, integrity versus despair. This is the basic idea that you look back on your life and you have a, hopefully, positive, but you have some kind of evaluation of your life. Are you happy with the way that you spent your time? And so there are always articles about this to read. Like, this is what people say. People towards the end of their life look back and these are their regrets, and we're hoping we can learn from those. A common theme here is that people often say, I wish I had spent more time with my family. I wish I had spent more time doing things that I love to do, that kind of thing. It depends on you. It depends on what your life goals are. But of course, if you can look back on your life and feel like you're satisfied, then you may feel prepared for the end of life with integrity, feeling like I did the right thing, I'm happy with the way my life went. If you feel like your life did not go well, then this can lead to feelings of despair because you may not feel like you have time to make adjustments. So think about that now. All right. When we're evaluating Ericksons theory, one of the best things here is that it does focus on development as a lifelong process. A lot of times we think about development as something that happens maybe from conception to maybe 18, and then we think, well, I'm an adult, I'm set now. No, you definitely go through different periods, and that's not just social development. You have biological and cognitive development going on too beyond childhood. So that's definitely a strength of Ericksons theory. But there are criticisms here. There are some concerns that especially early on that those stages may be too rigid, saying that this is the problem from 0 to 1, and then this is the problem from 1 to 3. The stages do become less rigid as you get further out, but certainly the early ones are a bit specific when it comes to timing. But one of the biggest issues with Ericksons theory is that the stages, the struggles, the challenges, those are not necessarily something you go through once and you figure it out and solve it and then you're done. So for example, trust versus mistrust. You can still have trust issues that develop after your first birthday. So it's not like that's the only time period where trust is important. Certainly your identity is a time period, during adolescence where you're trying to figure out who you are. But you can still be trying to figure out who you are as an early adult or as middle adulthood. So certainly some of these issues continue to come up later. They don't necessarily only happen during those particular stages. But I like the idea behind Ericksons theory. Like Piaget, I would say it's a good general rule of thumb. All right. And then really the rest of what we're going to be talking about today is a little bit more specific information about social contexts that you might find yourself in. And one of the most important social relationships that children have, and is still important later in life as well, would be their relationship with their parent. So I'm going to try not to camp out here too long. My thesis was actually heavily impacted by parenting styles. So when you're looking at different ways of categorizing parenting, there are several different potential terms we could use, different theories we could refer to. But Baumann's parenting styles are really the classical ones that you'll see most in research. So there's a good amount of research here to suggest that Baumann was onto something here. So Baumann suggested that there are two major components of parenting. You have discipline or structure, and then you have love and affection. And so Baumgarten would say that you can be high or low on each one of those, which then creates these 4 potential options. So first of all, with neglectful parenting, Baumgarten would say that neglectful parents are low on discipline and structure, and then also low on love and affection. So these are parents that are not giving the rules and the practical hands-on guidance, but they're also not giving that love and that affection. Basically, these parents are uninvolved. Now, obviously, the name suggests this is not the way we want to go with parenting. Some related outcomes. Now, first of all, I do want to say these outcomes are correlational. This is a situation where we cannot do experimental research. You cannot randomly assign a parent into the neglectful parenting category. Obviously, that's not ethical. So instead, we do this research by asking parents, if we're talking about children, to say, how do you parent your child? And then we look at the child and figure out the outcomes. If we're doing research on maybe older children or college students, then we could say, how did your parents parent you? And finding out your outcomes both from the child. But what we see is that there's a correlation between neglectful parenting and poor self-control in children, not handling independence, low achievement. So children who may not be reaching their full potential, that's oftentimes correlated with neglectful parenting. So then permissive parenting is parenting that is low on discipline and structure, but high on love and affection. So whereas neglectful parents didn't give anything, permissive parents do give love and affection. However, they set very few restrictions. So these are the situations where the child is basically in control. The parent does, either they don't set the rules, or if they do set the rules, they don't enforce those rules. There's no punishment associated with not meeting those rules. Now, what I do want to say is that in the South, we tend to have a stereotypical authoritarian parenting style, which I'm going to touch on in a second. We tend to look down on permissive parenting quite a bit. But some information specifically from my thesis suggested that although neither one of these is ideal, part of it does depend on your culture. If you are receiving some less than ideal parenting, but all the people around you are getting that same kind of parenting, it's not quite as harmful. But that's a whole nother conversation for another day. This is not a class on my thesis. I wouldn't subject you guys to that. Alright, so as far as permissive parents go, permissive parents set their children up to have poor self-control. So the child has never had to learn self-control. And so you can see that this is going to be correlated with poor academic performance. My parents didn't make me do my homework, so I'm not going to do my homework. Parents didn't make me go to school, I'm not going to go to school. But it's also associated with substance use and maybe potentially other things in that general nature. So maybe some illegal behavior or maybe some eating issues, that kind of thing. Basically children having really low self-control. On the other hand, the flip side of permissive is authoritarian parenting. This is parenting that is high on discipline and structure but low on love and affection. Now, this is stereotypically considered a Southern style of parenting. I think that this is a cultural norm that we perhaps have stricter expectations for children in the South than we do in other parts of the country. I've talked to people who were raised in different parts of the country and had different experiences here. But with an authoritarian parenting style, it's that idea that children are supposed to be seen and not heard. That children are supposed to follow these rigid rules. And the thing about, rules are good. The thing about the rules is, though, that they need to be appropriate. They need to be age appropriate. And the child needs to try to understand, try to explain to the child why we have those rules. So obviously the lack of love and affection is a problem here. What we see is that correlationally, children who have had authoritarian parents tend to have social issues, tend to be anxious, and you can imagine why this might be. If a child was never given an opportunity to communicate early on because they were supposed to be seen and not heard, then perhaps they never learn appropriate skills. They're used to having kind of a dictatorship situation and then may not be able to appropriately assert themselves later in life. So then, if none of these are the one we want, there has to be one. Here we go. Authoritative parenting. Now, don't let this throw you off. The endings are different. Authoritative is the one we want, not authoritarian, we want authoritative. So authoritative parenting is parenting that is high on structure and discipline, as well as high on love and affection. So there are rules that are set. Those are rules that are appropriate. And when the child breaks the rules, the parent calmly disciplines the child, but the child needs to understand why these rules are in place. We have an open dialogue about the rules. But in addition, the parent shows love and affection. The parent is genuinely looking out for the best interest of the child. So correlationally, we see that children who have been exposed to authoritative parenting tend to be more self-reliant, get along better with peers, have higher self-esteem. Generally speaking, authoritative parenting is ideal. It's associated with the best outcomes. Now, of course, things can get complicated when you have combinations of parenting. So maybe perhaps you have a permissive mother and authoritarian father. That does not add up to authoritative parenting. So it's important to try to get all parents on board. This is more complicated even with a blended family where we might have step parents and other people involved in the child's life. It's important for everyone to be on the same page when it comes to parenting. I could camp out there for a while, but instead I'm going to kind of move along here to some ways that family is changing in our culture during this particular time period. So first of all, parents are more likely to be working outside of the home than ever before, particularly the mother. So we see more dual income, dual earner families now. Perhaps this is because of cost of living. There are many potential factors that play a role in which parents are working. However, there's a lot of questions here. Is it harmful for children to have both parents working full-time? Well, one of the things that the research has suggested is that it does depend on the nature of the parent's work. So, authoritative parenting is best. High structure, high love and affection. If you are working in a job that is long hours, that is very stressful on you as a parent, it becomes hard, not impossible, but harder to provide that authoritative environment for children. So the nature of the job does matter, whether it's a high-stress job, whether it's a job that the parent has difficulty adjusting to. There's certainly some careers that can be traumatic, thinking about things like being a surgeon, being a paramedic. There's certainly things that can be, and being a psychologist could also fall into that category of bringing your work home with you and having a lot of stress associated. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, the divorce rate at the moment is hovering right around or slightly above 50%, which is obviously not ideal. But because divorce is becoming more common, there are more and more children who are having to deal with their parents divorcing. There are several different things that impact this. The best thing that you can do to try to reduce harm from a divorce situation is for the child to be able to maintain high quality contact with both parents. Now that's hard to do sometimes because parents might move, or because of custody situations, or because parents might be bitter towards each other, which then makes it hard for the child to have an unbiased relationship with each. But the best thing you can do is to have the child still have good contact with both parents. But the timing also, especially during that maybe adolescent time period, it's difficult for children as they're starting to figure out their identity, as they're starting to pursue the idea of their own romantic relationships. That makes it difficult. Does the child have support systems? What kind of custody is it? A calm, friendly custody situation or not? Socioeconomic status. So when there is a divorce, children often spend the majority of their time with their mother. However, mothers may not be in the workforce or may not be making as much money as fathers, so that can be causing some poverty situations as well. And then does this impact schooling? So will the child have to switch school systems, move, that kind of thing. So it's best if everyone, not just parents, but teachers and everyone who provides care interacts with a child in a way that is authoritative. That's ideal. So then because of the increase in divorce families, we're also going to have an increase in blended families. So you may see that children who have gone through divorce, which is a major shift, may have to have another shift if there's a remarriage, step family, so maybe not just a step parent, but maybe also siblings coming in as well. We do see that children in step families tend to show more adjustment problems. This is correlational, of course, and is especially during adolescence. Part of this may be because of the increase in the number of individuals in the child's life. It may be difficult to get everybody on the same page. So if I had a child client come in that needed some changes to help address a psychological issue, if that child has mom and stepdad and dad and stepmom and then a variety of siblings and you have teacher, it's hard to get all of these people on the same page when it comes to, authoritatively raising the child, setting the same rules, being consistent. And so I think because of that complication, that may be part of the reason why you see adjustment issues. So I talked earlier about your mesosystem being a link between microsystems, and one of the most important ones is the link between the school and the family. So if we're talking about a child who is going to a traditional school setting, they are going to be spending a lot of time there. And it's very important for a family, especially parents, to feel like they have a connection, that they are informed of what's going on while the child is at school. So some of the things that the school can do, providing assistance to families, so maybe having workshops, maybe having some programs where the parents can come in and the teachers can say, okay, this is what we're learning right now, this is how you can help at home. So having them maybe be volunteers in the classroom, perhaps, if possible, which is hard with work schedules, I understand, but having them see what their child is doing, how they can help at home. Letting the families at least voice their opinion on certain school decisions can be important. Can be complicated when you have that many people who are voicing opinions and probably won't all agree, but at least they should feel like they are informed of what's going on. So communicating with them about the child's progress. We're going to talk later when we talk about assessments about ways to do this, but report cards, progress reports, just sending home letters, and there's new technology now. Teachers are emailing family members perhaps. And as I said, teaching the parents how to engage their children in learning activities at home. So talk about what books to read, talk about how to help them with their homework, that kind of thing. And maybe beyond just the family, having the community get involved, having the community be a support system is fantastic whenever possible. Now, in addition to your parents and your teachers, you're also going to be impacted by your peers. So children will fall into, roughly here we have 3 categories, and there may be some individuals that don't fit perfectly into each one of these categories, but as far as peer statuses go. So first of all, some children would be considered popular, and you would consider a child popular based on the research they did here, asking their classmates, do you feel like this person is your best friend? Do you like this person? That kind of thing. So the popular children were the ones that were most frequently nominated as best friend. So there were several different children who said, yeah, I'm really good friends with that person, and were generally not disliked by their peers. Now, obviously, this sounds ideal, right? We want our kids to be popular. I'm sorry, but when I say popular, I don't know if you guys have seen Wicked, but the song pops into my head. I'm doing my best not to burst out. I really don't do Broadway. But I don't sing Broadway. I do enjoy Broadway. But no, and that's a whole other conversation. When you're talking about a popular child, although they may have a good experience here, it's also important to think about how this might potentially be difficult for a child. If you have achieved a popular status, you want to make sure that you maintain that popular status. So there can be a lot of peer pressure associated, that kind of thing. Then you may have children who are kind of considered neglected here. Now, what we mean by the neglected children, they're not really liked, but they're not really disliked. So I'm not best friends with that person, but they're okay. I don't really have a problem with that person. So these may be children that, although they're not disliked, they may still feel lonely because they may not feel like they have a best friend, someone to confide in. But then finally, you would have the category of rejected children. These would be individuals who, in addition to not being labeled as best friend very often, they may be disliked by their peers. And so there may be certain children that are more likely to be rejected. One thing that might come to mind here, children who have behavior issues, children who have violence, aggressive issues. Maybe the bully might potentially fall into this category here. So as a teacher, you have a lot going on. You have a lot you already have to do. but trying to get kids to interact with each other in ways that are kind. At the very least, modeling kindness to each other. There's much to be said here about the concept of bullying, and although the vast majority of people do experience bullying at some point, sometimes it's more severe than others, and I do understand that it's difficult to know exactly when to step in and when to just kind of let kids sort things out themselves, but you would definitely want to keep a close eye on those situations. Now, we're talking about social settings here, but I want you just kind of generally overall thinking about different educational options for your activity 3. So what I ask you to do here is to discuss the pros and cons of various types of educational settings. So you could think about things like public school versus private school versus homeschool, maybe charter school if you know anything about charter schools. So I want you to be thinking about some good things and some bad things about each of these, kind of generally. I like the idea of this, but there are some issues with it, that kind of thing. And then I ask you a question, and this is a difficult question and one that you may not be able to answer right now, but I want you to do your best. What kind of education would you choose for your children? Many of you may not have children at the moment. Some of you may not be planning to have children, period. But there are several different ways you could ask this question. You could say, what kind of school setting would you want to work in? That could be one way to think about it. What kind of school setting do you overall think is best? But it becomes very personal when I ask you the question, what kind of school setting would you want for your own children? So this is what I want you to be thinking about for activity 3. So let me know if you have any questions, but remember that it does need to be at least 200 words long. All right. Our last thing we're going to be talking about today is moral development. Now, when we talk about morals, we're talking about your personal sense of right and wrong. And when we're talking about your moral development, it is social. It belongs in the social lecture because you pick up on the morals of other people. You learn from your parents. You learn from peers. You learn from the media. You learn from culture, perhaps from religious environments. So you learn your morals from other people. So Kohlberg suggested that there were 3 main levels of moral development. You have pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional levels. So very young children do understand morality to an extent. But as you get older, your understanding of morality changes a little bit. So during this pre-conventional stage, and you'll notice there's not specific age ranges here, but this would be the first one. You'd go through them in this order. During the pre-conventional stage, your moral reasoning is controlled by rewards and punishments. So I'm not going to hit my sister because I would be punished for hitting my sister. I'm going to clean my room because I will be rewarded for cleaning my room. So it's more like I'm going to follow the rules because of what I get out of it. And at a young age, this may be all that children are able to understand. So this is why it's important to have structure and to have discipline so children do start to develop a sense of morality. But we don't want to spend our entire lives here. We don't want to be adults that say, I'm not going to engage in this harmful behavior because I don't want to go to jail. That's not the only reason you don't engage in that harmful behavior. So then as you develop, you move into what Kohlberg referred to as a conventional stage, where you are doing something because it's the rules and you have internalized standards of other people. Okay, it's wrong to murder. It's wrong to lie. We have internalized these rules that are set by other people. And so, okay, well, it's not because I don't want to get in trouble. It's because following the rules is important. But the thing here is that it's not your rules, it's someone else's rules. These are standards imposed by others. Now, the tricky thing is that not everyone has the same moral standards. So you are likely to adopt the moral standards of the people you spend the most time with and the culture that you are most deeply embedded in. However, when we switch gears to a post-conventional morality, which maybe not everyone gets here, but this would be the last level of moral development, where your morality is internal. It's not that you're doing something to avoid a punishment or get a reward. It's not that you're doing it because other people have taught you that it's the right thing to do. You're making your own decisions about morality based on your own personal opinions. So you might have different ideas of morality than other people around you. But at a post-conventional level, that's okay. You have your own internal standards. Now let's do a little bit of practice here. Sam starts to get out of his seat to sharpen his pencil without permission, but he stops because he realizes that if he does, Others might also do so, and this could cause disorder. He understands that it's his duty to follow the rules. So I would say at this point, Sam is in that conventional level because he says, I am not going to break the rule because the rule is important. I understand the rule, but it's not his rule. It's not something he set up. The teacher set up the rule, and Sam's going to follow it because that's what you do. You follow the teacher's rules. All right, Sam starts to get out of his seat to sharpen his pencil without permission, but he stops because he realizes that if he does, he will be punished. This is pre-conventional. I'm worried about the outcomes of this behavior. Will I be punished for this? I certainly won't be reinforced for this. So that's that early first stage. And then Sam starts to get out of his seat to sharpen his pencil without permission, but he stops because he realizes that if he does, it will displease his teacher. This is closer to a post-conventional level here. This is the idea that it is important to Sam himself for him to have good relationships with his teacher. He doesn't want to hurt his teacher. It's not because the teacher set the rule. It's because to him, personally, it's important for him to maintain good relationships with his teacher. And so because of that, he will choose to engage in what he considers moral behavior because of his own personal rules. All right, very good. So during today's lecture, I hope you got an idea of some of the social influences that play a role in who we become. And I hope you also picked up on the fact that your social development is not going to be something that stops at a certain age. It's something that continues throughout the lifespan. So don't forget about activity 3. Remember that needs to be at least 200 words long. Also, refer back to the introduction with the announcements. At this point, you have all the material that you need for exam 1. So make sure that you take exam 1. It'll be multiple choice, true, false, and matching. You'll have 75 minutes to take it. Once you start it, you'll need to finish it in one setting. And you also can refer to the review video. So I'm going to be posting a video of myself talking about the study guide. So let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys after exam 1.